So one thing that I've heard and that comes to mind is the idea of if kids are being schooled at home by parents, not everyone has great parents like you or like many other homeschooling parents. I know, but for my example, I have one good and competent parent, my mother, but my dad's not in my life at all. And when I was a teenager and I lived with my dad and my stepmom, was really not, uh, I guess you would say, a competent or suitable living environment for a teenager. And if they had homeschooled me, I would have been neglected, most likely, I would say. So I guess what safeguards are in place to make sure that no kids fall through the cracks if they're taken into homeschooling?
Well, first I would say it would probably be unlikely that your dad would have chosen to homeschool you, and of course he didn't. And I think that's part of it. You know, you already have kind of a self-selected group of families choosing to homeschool. And the number one reason that parents today choose to homeschool, according to the Federal Department of Education data, is concern about the environment of other schools, including negative peer pressure, bullying, drugs, all of these kinds of what we call kind of negative socialization experiences. So that's the top reason that most families choose to homeschool. That's followed by a desire for a more rigorous or more successful academic environment for their children. So if we think about those as kind of the primary motivators for today's homeschooling families, these are, you know, self-selected groups of parents who really want the best education for their kids. They don't feel like they can get that in a conventional classroom, public or private. And so they're willing to really kind of customize a much more individualized education plan for their children. And with so many of the resources available, particularly today, it's easier than ever before to homeschool your kids. Maybe we'll get to this too, but I think another myth of homeschooling is that, well, you need to have one parent home at all times to be kind of the full-time homeschooling parent. And that's not true. My husband and I both work, for example, and that's true of many families. I think that will be even more true now as remote learning, remote working becomes you know, much more acceptable and widespread in our culture, that there are these sort of flexible work environments that enable families to then give that same flexibility in learning to their children. And there are these incredible online learning tools. You know, I think one unfortunate outcome of the school closures and the remote Zoom schooling that we've experienced over the past year is it gives sort of virtual learning a bad name. And I hope that we can dispel that myth as well, because while remote district schooling might be a disaster with high levels of failure and kids really just not learning much at all in many cases, high quality virtual learning that's intended to be such, when you have these private providers of online learning resources or tools, for example, like Khan Academy, which is free online learning videos. In particular, they're known for their math programs for all levels, elementary and secondary school. These are fantastic resources for learning that are online. And I think a lot of families realized maybe that they never did before, that they do have access to these incredible tools that can help their children learn, and that their role really as homeschooling parents is to facilitate that learning, not necessarily to be, again, sitting at the kitchen table directing it.
So I guess that brings up one other thought is, with public schools, I can't say it works terribly well, or private schools or charter schools, there are open metrics, test scores, graduation rates, and then there's some effort made of quality control. Are they doing a good job? I think obviously with public schools, that's not always followed through on, but is there a system of quality control for homeschooling? How do we know which parents are doing a good job, which ones aren't, if any are giving kids a really subpar education?
Yeah, so the peer-reviewed research that has been done shows that homeschoolers generally outperform their school peers, that they don't have a problem adjusting to college should they choose to attend, that they do attend college at high rates or comparable rates to school children. Lindsay Burke at the Heritage Foundation did a literature review of all of the homeschooling outcomes, academic outcomes, and found that homeschoolers excel academically and have no problems sometimes, again, surpassing their peers that are in school. So I think a lot of, again, those concerns are unfounded. And then, if we compare that to the dismal academic results that we're seeing in public schools across the country, homeschoolers are really outshining, in many cases, their schooled peers. And I think in particular, if you look at the standardized test results in public schools, particularly for students of color, in many cases, in many districts, they're abysmal. And that could also explain why we've seen, not only according to the Census Bureau, an increase in homeschooling rates in all races and ethnicities over this past year, but even pre-pandemic, we saw, for example, a doubling of the Black homeschooling rate between 2008 and 2012. We saw, skyrocketing rates of Hispanic homeschoolers, I think, as parents realize they can do a better job than these district schools.
So one other thing I wanted to ask you about is there is kind of the stereotype of the socially awkward homeschooled kid who is like cringy in social interactions because they spend a lot of time at home. And I only know a few people. One of my good friends is homeschooled. I didn't learn that till like a year after I met her. I never would have guessed it. So from my unscientific sample size, that's certainly not true. But what do you say to people who worry that homeschooled kids won't get enough socialization or interaction with the outside world?
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting because my first introduction to homeschooling was when I was in college. I went to K-12 public schools and then went to college and was an economics major, but I became increasingly interested in education. So I took several education classes. And for one education seminar my senior year, I did an independent research project on homeschooling, and homeschooling had just come into the mainstream at the time. This was in the late 1990s. So it certainly, really hadn't made it into what we think of as a kind of a legitimate education choice that it is today. But I was able to shadow a homeschooling family for that semester. And my first question when I walked into that family's home was, what about socialization? And then I very quickly realized that the kind of socialization that in particular this homeschool child was getting was much more authentic than the sort of forced socialization that we experience in public schools. So in this case, this child was, again, immersed in her community, had all kinds of different interactions with people of all different ages and experiences. And she had a variety of mentors in her community and all kinds of different programs that she participated in, and after-school programs that involved other kids from the community, as well as homeschool programs. And again, this was in the late 1990s. Now there's just so many more homeschoolers that those experiences are much more widespread, and in many cases, certainly in urban areas like where I am, organizations and nonprofits cater to homeschoolers and provide programming specifically for homeschooled children. But it was interesting, that experience, seeing that homeschooled child and me saying, well, how could she possibly be homeschooled? And then watching this, again, this authentic socialization, that she had, and then seeing that contrasted with that same semester, I was doing a student teaching practicum in a local second grade elementary school. And I think before, I never really realized any kind of this contrast between authentic socialization, the kinds of socialization that you and I would do, where we just meet people socially in the community, and this age-segregated, command and control, kind of obedience-focused, conventional classroom that I had experienced as a child and that I was then witnessing with this second grade group. So it really, for me, made it clear that socialization happens by being social in a community, really building those relationships with our neighbors and community members and mentors. And it's not what we would think of as this age-segregated classroom. And I will just add one other piece to this. Daniel Hamlin is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, and he's done research on what he calls cultural capital for homeschoolers. And he finds that homeschoolers are much more likely than their school peers to go to the library, to go to the museum, to go to a community event, a sporting event, a musical event, to go to a bookstore, to go to a zoo, than their school peers. So homeschoolers are quite connected to their communities.